This program was offered in partnership with the Jewish Book Council. Hi, my name is Rabbi Alyssa Mendelson Graff, and I'm the rabbi at Port Jewish Center in Port Washington, New York. And just a few days ago, we were thrilled to welcome author Esther Amini to talk about her book, Concealed. Esther Amini is a writer, a painter, a psychoanalytic psychotherapist in private practice, and her stories have been published in Elle, Lilith, Tablet, and many other publications. She has been awarded the Aspen Word Emerging Writer Fellowship, as well as she's earned rave reviews for her book from the Times of Israel and many other publications. And a story from her book, Concealed, was featured on High Flicks, and that story is called Amreeka, Amreeka. Our conversation with Esther Amini went on for an hour, and it could have gone on much longer. We were fascinated by her book, we were fascinated by her story, and we were thrilled to be able to hear from her about it. So we hope that you enjoy our conversation with Esther Amini, author of Concealed.
I wrote a memoir. This is my first book. I've done a number of short stories, but Concealed is my first book. And for those of you who haven't read it, it's about growing up in the United States. It's an immigrant story. But what makes it a little different is that my parents came from the Iranian city of Mashhad. And Mashhad is very unique. It is not like any of the other cities. It is the most fanatically Islamic city in all of Iran. Zero tolerance for difference, which makes it very hard to be Jewish and to live there. And so the Jews lived there pretending they were Muslim. They led a life of duplicity. Those who know about the Mashhadi Jews often compare them to the Marranos of Spain. They led an underground life. They were very religious, Judaically, and above ground, they behaved like the Muslims. My mother wore the black chador, which is the black cloak that covered her from head to toe with little eye slits whenever she stepped out of the house. And my father prayed in the public squares with other Muslims 5 times a day, reading from the Quran. He knew the Quran like the back of his hand. And meanwhile, he'd come home and be a devout Jew. They kept Shabbat. My mother was braiding challah, all the Jewish holidays. Young boys were circumcised. There was a Mashhadi community, an underground community. They were very tight and looked out for one another. But it was a very difficult life. And this went on into the 1950s. So we're not talking about a long time ago. And when my parents came to the United States, which was right after World War II, this is before there was this real influx of Iranian Jews coming to the United States. They came during the Khomeini Revolution. But my parents came in 1947. They arrived here. And a few years later, I was born. So the baggage, what they brought with them, metaphorically, the values of the Islamic world. I mean, if I ever said that to my father, he'd say, "You're crazy. We didn't bring any Iranian values with us." And it was clear as day because, I mean, only now do I understand that. As a child, I didn't know what was going on. But the whole concept that a girl shouldn't be educated, she shouldn't learn to read or write, she should be married off at a very young age. My grandmother, this is my father's mother, she was married at the age of 9. At the age of 9, she was married off, match made, to my grandfather, who was then 29. I mean, it's hard to wrap your mind around that. And yet that was the norm. That was the Islamic norm. My mother was forced to marry my father when she was 14, and he was 34, another 20-year age difference. These are the values my father in particular brought with him to the United States, um, as well as paranoia, rightfully so. I mean, there was a lot to fear in Iran. For generations, they lived underground. And over time, when I thought about this as an adult, I really thought it went into their DNA. This whole idea of duplicity, secrecy, paranoia, distrusting the outside world, seriously distrusting the outside world, not giving it a chance to prove itself or to say who it is. And this all comes, I think, from the trauma of the life they led and the life their ancestors led. But the book begins with me as a child. And of course, I don't understand any of this. I'm just the recipient. And I'm experiencing it the way a 2, 3-year-old, 4-year-old would. And I'm confused. And it goes on. There are lots of humorous episodes, as well as poignant ones. But the humor comes from the culture clash, the misunderstandings between America and Iran, between my mother and my father, who were also diametric opposites, and me being caught in between as the youngest, the only daughter and the youngest of 3. My 2 brothers, one is 10 years older, the other one is 7 years older, and they arrived here with my parents when they were very young. But then girls are treated differently. And here I am, the youngest, the American born, a daughter. And so it's through that lens, I become a teenager and I have different thoughts and feelings about what feels like a very messy household, emotionally messy. And later I go off to college and I have different ways of thinking. And so it's an evolution. And what I tried to capture was the changes in the way I perceived my parents, the culture, me, who I need to be, and how do I find out who I need to be when I'm coming from a culture that's basically saying you dare not find out. We're going to tell you who you're going to be. And that's fine if you're living in Mashhad. But here I am growing up in the United States in the 50s and the 60s, and throw into that pot during the 1960s, there's the sexual revolution all of a sudden. And girls are popping the pill. Pot is rampant. People are high. It's a revolutionary time. The Vietnam War is going on. There are demonstrations. And all of this made my father crazy. Absolutely insane. Like he detested America from the day he arrived. And as life went on, America proved to him he was right. Like he felt it was just a hedonistic country and it just had zero morality and ethics, and wanted to protect me from it from a very, very young age. And so I didn't know that. I mean, what I felt was that he was crazy because he would say things and do things that felt insane. But when I look back, it really was his way of protecting. So that's it in a nutshell. But I'd love to hear your questions and see where it goes.
Okay, sorry. I had to find the unmute button. So I know that people, before we go to a general Q&A, I just wanted to ask you a few questions of my own. And the first was, what is it the Mashhadi community like today? You know, in terms of
where, what it, I mean, there are no Jews left in Mashhad, I assume. Where are they, and what is it like? I mean, are you an example of the typical like next generation Mashhadi woman? Like what does that look like?
Well, I can tell you what I know. I'm not the final word on this, but um, from what I've been told, there's a woman in Vienna who's doing a research project on the Jews of Mashhad, and she contacted me and she said that last year she went to Mashhad. Um, I've never been to Iran. And she said there wasn't a Jew. There wasn't one Jew in Mashhad, and she was looking for it because she knew about the story of the Jews from Mashhad, and she's writing this all up. Of course, there are Jews in Tehran, there are Jews in other cities, but she said she couldn't find one. And it's understandable. It's a fanatically Islamic city, zero tolerance. It's a pilgrimage site. It's known for maiming and massacring infidels, and anyone who is not exactly like them is an infidel. And under the regime, under today's regime, it's impossible to live there. So I'm not surprised that you said there are none. As for the Mashhadis, I mean, over time, probably, well, I can't really say beginning when, but they started to drift, and there's a community, a very strong, tight-knit Mashhadi community in Milan, Italy, in Hamburg, Germany, in London, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem. I would suspect in other cities in Israel as well. And in New York, it's in Great Neck. Great Neck has a very large, tight-knit Mashhadi community. Not so much in LA. I think LA has the Tehranis, the Jews from Tehran, for the most part. I mean, they may have some Jews from Mashhad, but they're known to be a Tehrani community. I really can't speak too much about what that next generation, the younger generation, is feeling in Great Neck today, because I actually married an Ashkenazi and I'm living in Manhattan, and my life is very different. I do occasionally get calls from young women from that community who are struggling, and I'm not saying this speaks for all of them, but occasionally I get a call, and they're struggling not in the way I had to struggle. They are allowed to go to school, and many of them end up going to college locally. The idea is that you live at home, you don't move into a dorm. There are few and far between that do move out and go into a dorm, but again, we're talking the majority. And the expectation is that they marry and they become mothers and housewives, and not put too much of their energy into something outside of the home. I mean, if they do have some kind of a career, it needs to be manageable and in a miniature size where children and family loom large and are most important. And there are girls who struggle with that because they have an urge, an ache to do something very big, and they don't want to conform to that formula. And it means they think it means that they go out and do it, they will lose the love and the support system of their parents and their family and their community. They're also expected to marry within the community. There are those who don't, but the majority do. And that can sometimes create a problem. Being raised in this country and going to school where they're meeting Ashkenazis as well. So there are certain pressures, but I think bringing it back to me, I was that first generation American in the 1950s and 60s where my father didn't want me to go to elementary school. And it was a whole different ball of wax. He knew that he had to send me because it was a law. If it wasn't a law, he would have kept me at home. And I had to hide my interest in reading. And I would read with a flashlight under the bed sheets at night. And I called myself later on, I called myself a booklegger because I would stash books between the mattress and he would walk in at night doing night patrol, making sure that I was asleep. And if he caught me with a book, he'd blow a fuse and he'd grab the book and tell me to turn all my lights off, meaning my mental lights, and he would turn the light off. And then I'd reach under and pull out another book and have my flashlight in hand. But that's how I grew up feeling like a criminal. You know, I really felt like I'm an outlaw and reading is sinful. And yet I was so intrigued by what I was reading. It didn't matter what it was. I could be reading Heidi, I could be reading Black Beauty. It was like, wow, I was being transported into another world. And I became addicted very early on to the written word. So, I mean, those experiences, the girls growing up in Great Neck, I don't think they're having that at all. So it was very specific to my day and to my family. I'm not saying every family was treating their daughter that way either in the 50s and 60s, but it was very specific to my family.
Do you think that there were families though, just, I mean, as a follow-up, so when you were growing up, did you, and you didn't, I don't think you talked about this in your book, but were there other girls like you who had, you know, I mean, I don't know, I hope it's okay to say that your parents seemed uniquely a little bit, what's the right word? Crazy, you know, like they seemed, you know, they had their, some, you know, and yet, you know, it seems like so many of their, so many of the, so much of their personality was because of what they had experienced in Mashhad, which feels like so many other families would have, people, you know, would have experienced something similar. So, do you know what I'm saying? So, did you know, were you growing up with other Mashhadi kids, you know, and were their parents similar to your parents in some ways? Did you take any solace in that? What was, you know, what was it like, you know, with other, you know, what was their assimilation experience like side by side with yours?
Yeah, I had friends in the community and they would come over secretly because my father didn't want anyone to come over. And they empathized with me. Their parents were not like mine. And I think I do write about that. I have a piece in the book where I say that I'm always comparing, like, what are these other fathers like? And they seem to be able to balance America and Iran. You know, they felt appreciative that they were in the United States. And there was the Iran that they remembered and they drew from. And then there was the America that they were valuing and enjoying. And that wasn't the case for my father. He had brought the horrors and the terror of Mashhad with him, and he hadn't left it behind. And so I had dear friends in the community, you know, little girls, and eventually we became teenagers and we would talk to each other, and they all felt so sorry for me because my father was so extreme and my mother was wild. I mean, she was outrageous. She was, at times, she had a hysterical sense of humor, so people enjoyed her. She was theatrical. She had a knack for imitating others facially, their voices, and she saw through hypocrisy and she nailed it. I mean, she was a comic by nature. So people found her very entertaining, but she also was very impulsive and didn't censor herself. And burned bridges. And so people were wary of her as well, not getting too close, perhaps not trusting that she would be consistently caring. And so my friends saw all of this and they empathized. You know, they felt, at times we would laugh about it, we would joke about it, we would talk about it, but they felt for me. So I felt still very alone with it, except I had, and I still have, two older brothers, and my brothers played a very important role in my life. And even though they were much, much older, you know, when you're 8 and the other brother is 10 years older and he's 18, that's a pretty big age difference at that time. And yet they each were parentified children and they parented me in a very caring, loving way. So as I felt alone, I had them, and that helped to a great degree.
Your portrayal of your brothers is so beautiful and moving, and in some ways they, they feel like some of the heroes of your story. The way I think all of us who read it wished we had brothers like that. I only have a sister and she's wonderful, but it was such a beautiful, loving portrayal of them. Where I think people were really curious to know, where are your brothers now? How do they feel about your memoir? Did they marry women from the Mashadi community, or did they marry Persian women? Did they marry Ashkenaz? What were their choices?
Well, they each married a Mashadi. As I said, there's a community in Milan and of Mashadi Jews, and they coincidentally each found a woman within that community from Italy and married and brought their wives here. So, and they, they're terrific. I mean, they consistently are caring and supportive and happy for me that I've written this book. So it's all good.
It's so interesting that they chose to marry Mashadi women, and yet they really helped guide you kind of out of the Mashadi path, in a sense, making sure that, unlike your grandmother and your mother before you, that you were able to pursue. And I mean, I think it was also your own determination. You can speak to that obviously more than I could, but just my impression from the book. But they made sure that you got your education, that the image of your brother sneaking you out for your, I think it was like a college interview or something, like running into the car and hitting the gas. I mean, those are such powerful images, and very untraditional, and yet they kind of took some traditional, they kind of took a slightly more traditional path in terms of staying within the community.
Right. Right.
What do you think the message, what, for somebody reading your book, and there are some really good pictures, questions in the comments already, but for somebody reading your book, like, what audiences are you writing this book for? And, I guess every author says for everyone, but, if you were, I guess, what is the message that you want the reader to take away about, about your journey, about your community? And I have a follow-up question, which is, what is the message that, I mean, I would imagine as a mother, writing this book, knowing that your children and your nieces and nephews will be reading it, what do you hope they'll take from this story and pass on to another generation?
Mm. Well, let's go. I have a trouble holding on to 2, 3 questions.
Sorry.
So I'll start with what I think was your first, which is, why did I write the book? Was that it? Who is it for?
Who is it for, and what is the message that you hope the reader will take away from it?
Okay. when I wrote the book, I didn't know who it was for. I didn't have this was not meant to have, I didn't say to myself, this is going to have commercial success, so let me think of an audience. I needed to write this. This was very much a very personal project. And it was a story that was heavy, and it laid inside of me. With all the humor and all the crazy wild moments that took place, it was heavy. And I felt that if I don't put this down on paper, it's going to disappear. I am the bridge between my parents, who actually lived that underground duplicitous life, and my American children who are growing up here as if they came off the Mayflower, you know? And so if I don't write this, will their children know? Will their grandchildren, who I will never know? And so there was that feeling. I felt there was a compulsion that I have to do this. And also I'm the first to be able to read and write. The first female from my family. I'm not saying this is true for every family, because I know all of a sudden I'll get emails from some Mashhadi who will say it didn't apply to me. But I'm just talking about from my family. I am the first female from my mother's side and father's side that actually went to school, became literate, went off to college, no less, went off to graduate school, went to postgraduate training. And I say to myself, if I don't write, who will? And so there was that. So I worked on it for 5 years, and I really poured myself into it and kept changing it and putting more in, taking some out, trying to create a cohesive whole. And then said to myself, it was at that point that I said, you know, some of my stories have been taken. Elle magazine took a story, and they seem to be, and these are autobiographical stories, and they seem very interested. Let me send the book out and see what happens. And it got snatched. And so it was like organic. It just happened that, and I went with it. And so now I'm getting emails and I'm getting letters from people from around the world saying, I've read your book, and this is what I'm gleaning. And I listened closely because I didn't have an agenda. I didn't say to myself, you know, when I write this, I want the reader to think about, I mean, I didn't want it to be that way. I didn't want it to be prescriptive. I didn't want it to be formulaic. And I just wanted it to be honest and to be engaging. And people have written to me saying, one person wrote and said, your book is all about resilience and not giving up. And it's inspiring. And regardless of what our obstacles are, whatever the obstacles are that are placed in front of us or that we place in front of ourselves, we can overcome them. And I said to myself, oh, that's nice that she felt that. Someone else wrote and said, you know, your book is really about deciding what to take from one's legacy and what to leave behind. And what I really felt what you were doing the whole time was trying to tease out what is precious and needs to be passed on to the next generation, and what you need to make sure isn't passed on to the next generation. And I said to myself, wow, I see that. I can see that. But I didn't write with that intent. It came out naturally. So it really depends. And I'd love to hear what your readers, you out there who have read the book, what your takeaway was.
So I think, I think we have some people who definitely want to share that. I'm just wondering, before we open it to questions, you know, just my follow-up questions. So in terms of what you want, you know, what you hope your children will take away from this, what you hope, and also I think, you know, that what the second letter you talked about, you know, what is it that you hope your kids will leave behind, and what do you hope that they will bring with them in terms of from this story and from their heritage as, you know, as part of the Mashadi community, you know, growing out of the, descending from the Mashadi community? What do you hope that they'll take with them moving forward?
Coming out, you know, because I'm not living that Mashhadi life and I'm not in that community, I think what I glean, and I think I have passed on with the help of my husband, together we've done this, is to pass on the beauty and significance of Judaism. I mean, this underground community held on so tightly to Judaism, and their main purpose was to not allow it, not allow themselves to assimilate and not allow it to just evaporate, and to make sure that their heritage, their legacy, their tie to Judaism is passed from generation to generation. And I wanted our children to be educated and to understand the wisdom of Judaism and to be able to use it and identify with it and make it part of their identity and pass it on to their children. That has been accomplished. I mean, that I can say. My children are now married and they have children and they're raising them in that way. And so I really feel in that department, my job is done. What else did I want? I think from the book, I had very strong feeling that I want my children to feel, and this is the way we raised them also, that they can speak, that their voices can be heard. It doesn't matter what they're saying, as long as they say it respectfully, they can speak. And I came from a home where my father banned speech and banned books. And I understand it now, but it was something I did not want them to ever feel. And that controversy is healthy. And having a different point of view is healthy. And they shouldn't be afraid. My father believed speech would lead to violence. He didn't really believe that one could have a discussion with someone else and then work out some kind of resolution or just respectfully say we differ. He really thought it would end up with bloodshed. And so that was his reason. He just said, you know, he used to say, change subject. This was his way of bringing an end. Change subject. And he would jump out of his seat and we would all like freeze for a minute. And I don't want my children to feel they have to change the subject.
Brenda wrote, now that your book has been so beautifully received, have you been amazed by many other immigrant groups who identify with you? Also, have you discovered other family members living elsewhere since your book has been published?
Oh my goodness. Yes, yes, yes to both questions. I am in a state of awe and shock because I get emails from people I can't even begin to tell you, from the Midwest, from farms. They're not Jewish, they're not Persian, and they say, I identify with your story. I identify with you. I identify with the problems you had. And I'm beginning to understand. At first I was astounded, and I'm beginning to understand that, you know, the skeletal structure of the book has universal themes. And it is speaking to people from different backgrounds, different nations, different ages. And because it has, I think, so many threads running through it. One is, how do you find yourself? How do you figure out who you are? Especially if you come from a background, a family, a culture that is telling you this is who you need to be. And we can talk about the Midwest, and we can talk about China, and we can talk about Afghanistan. It doesn't really matter. It's the same theme. Mother-daughter relationship. No matter how wonderful your mother may be, the mother-daughter relationship is loaded. And it's hard because girls want to separate and individuate from their mothers. And then how do they do that? Sometimes they do it in a way that feels rupturous. And sometimes they don't do it and they resent their mothers. And that whole mother-daughter symbiosis is an issue for many, many people. The father-daughter relationship, getting to know your father. How much of him will he let you know? How much do you want to know? How do you handle what you know? There are the sibling relationship. Not that everyone has or had my brothers, but I think it makes them think about their own, if they do have a sibling, about their own sibling relationships, and it makes you revisit. I think the whole idea of being an outsider and always feeling like an outsider, I think even though I was born and raised here and I can pass as American easily, I don't feel American. And I think a lot of people house that. They don't have to come from another country to feel they're not totally American. They could be born here and raised here, but there's a culture in their home that is occupying a lot of them internally. And that feeling of being an outsider. So the value of being an outsider, I mean, there's a lot of value in it. And I think it turns people into artists very often, where they feel that they can stand outside and look in a way in which those who are insiders can't. There's a different perspective, a different vision. So there are so many themes, and I am getting wonderful fan mail, and I encourage you to write to me if you feel like it, because I have a website, an author's website, EstherAmini.com. And when you go there, there's a tab you can press and contact me. But so that was to answer that question. What was the other one? I forgot.
The other part was also, have you discovered other family members living elsewhere since your book has been published?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I wrote about my mother's stepmother. Her name was Yocheved. That was always a mystery to me. I mean, she was a very good woman to my mother. My mother was an orphan. And when her mother gave birth to her, she died. In other words, my grandmother died giving birth to my mother. And so Yocheved raised her. And my mother didn't really want to talk about Yocheved and told me she was a good woman, but resented her because she wasn't her mother. She wasn't her genetic mother. And she'd never show me a photograph. I kept saying, don't you have anything? I mean, she raised you. No, no pictures, no nothing, not interested. And so I wrote this book. And a few months later, I received an email from Yocheved's granddaughter, who lives in London, said, I read your book and I'd love to connect with you. And we had a telephone conversation. And it threw me, I mean, it was wonderful, wonderful. But here I am forming a relationship with Yocheved's granddaughter when my mother wouldn't acknowledge Yocheved as her mother. So that's just one example, but there are many. So yes, the answer is yes.
Wow, that is
wow.
amazing. Okay, Joyce, do you have a question, Joyce Landsman?
Well, it's not so much a question. There are two things. One, it was on page 169 of your book when your brother David at age 21 said to you at age 14, S, create a mind you want to live with. And I thought that that was such a profound lesson he was teaching you. And I really appreciate it. It meant a lot to me. The other thing I was going to say is we have a lot in common. Although mine wasn't as strict as yours, there's a lot in common. And I remember at the age of 15 and asking my father the umpteenth time if I could do something my friends were doing, and he was saying no. Instead of pulling a tantrum or getting really upset, I just took a breath and I said, Dad, it's really hard to have one leg in Baghdad and one leg here. The straddle is just too difficult. And I knew he wasn't going to change his mind, but for the first time, I was able to put things into words. And that's the other thing that you're bringing out for me to remember. A lot of my words were silent, even though not to the extreme that you experienced. I realized I'm the oldest with 2 younger brothers. So I didn't have a brother to help me. I got, like the inexperienced parents trying to raise their first child in America type of thing. But I just want to thank you, because as other people have pointed out to you, it's opened up a whole new venue for understanding oneself through your life and your experiences that may have been put in the background for one reason or another. And all of a sudden now at 73, I'm looking at these things and going, so that's why. So I want to thank you. I don't have a question. I just want to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
Wow. Very meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Cheryl Epsteiner, you had a question.
Hello, everybody. I'm a gate crasher from Atlanta, and I'm part of a Jewish women's book club. We read your book a couple of months ago, and through a roundabout way, I heard you were speaking, and the group was kind enough to let me in. There was a scene in your book that actually had me gasping. Your parents were having a party, and their friends from Mashadi were there. And your mother starts to berate your father for his lack of sexual interest and his less than sterling performance. And she humiliates him in front of everyone, including you. And I'm just wondering, it was such an incredible thing to read. It was just unbelievable. How did your parents' marriage survive that? I mean, I'm sure everybody who was there was so embarrassed. How did they continue their place in the community? And why did they continue to live with each other? Why did your father accept that behavior from your mother?
He didn't have any options, because in that world, at that time, in that culture, you don't separate, you don't divorce. So what are you left with? You're left with that mate, regardless of what's going on. I mean, he was furious, as you read afterwards, and when everyone left, he berated her, and she tearfully ran into the bedroom, and that's how it ended. But in terms of leaving, creating new lives, that option was never there. Wasn't there. And I had to throw that story in because, as difficult as it was to put it in, I felt if I don't, the reader is not going to get a sense of her mother. Like, she could be heroic, and she was heroic at times. She had my back when I moved into Barnard, and she came every Tuesday and took me out for lunch, and my father had excommunicated me and wasn't going to talk to me and was sitting Shiva, and she was coming, and so there was that. And then there was the woman who was talking about my father's penis in front of a crowd of Mashhedi Jews, and the same person. So just to give you a sense of her extremes and how hard it was as a child and as an adolescent to put it together as to who is she. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Marcia Appel, I know you have some questions.
So, hi, I really enjoyed your book.
Thank
One
you.
quick silly question and then another question, but what does one do with pickles, cows, intestines? Other than stuffed derma, which I don't know if those are pickled, but
Well, I don't really know. This is what I was told he was doing.
okay. I was also wondering, your brothers had budding careers that they then gave up to help with your family. I was wondering, did they resent that? Did they just feel that was something they needed to do? How did they come to terms with that?
It's hard for me to talk on behalf of them because I don't ask that question of them. And so it would be artificial if I start speaking on their behalf. From what I see, I think that they feel, because they did very well in their fields later on, and they live very comfortable lives, and they've given their children a very good life. I think they feel it all worked out, but as to really what they're feeling internally, I don't know.
So another question that somebody asked me to ask is, what was the support? Was there a support system, or what was the support system like among the Mashadi women that your mom knew? Like, how did they support one another, or did they? Like, I feel like there's a scene in the book where your mom's like, all these women come over to your house and they're all cooking together and talking about their husbands, and but was there a support system? I mean, your mom, I mean, your mom's life, you paint a picture of your mom that is both like, it makes me angry at her on your behalf, but it also makes me feel very sympathetic towards her. Like, sure, her life, her story, and I think it was so beautiful the way you painted the picture of a an incredibly imperfect person, like in some ways we all are, who did the best she could with the tools that life handed her.
Right.
So how did she, what kind of support system did she have? What was it like? I mean, you alluded to it a little bit earlier. Like, there were some people who, they loved her because she was funny. They stayed her a little bit distance from her because she, had such a sharp, whatever. I don't remember the word you used, but is there enough of a question in there for you to answer it?
Yeah, well, I think I have to redefine support system when I think of it in terms of her and her life in that community. It's not like today where we say, oh, I have these friends, and we sit and we talk heart to heart, and we're there for each other no matter what. And that's our modern day notion of friends as a support system. I think in her world at that time, when I would come down into the kitchen every Sunday, she had women that she would invite over to cook with her, and they would be baking. It was really baking. And it was reminiscent of the days of Mashhad. I think that made her really feel good, because that's what women did. They got together in the kitchen and they baked and they talked and they complained and they laughed and they cried, and then they divided the baked goods and everybody went home. Maybe that was like a therapy session for them. I mean, they didn't necessarily solve each other's problems. When I would come down and sit on a stool in the corner and I needed a study break from my schoolwork, and I'd sit there and eavesdrop, and I heard them all complaining constantly about their husbands, I didn't hear much resolution, so it was ventilating. They were venting, and venting maybe helped her temporarily, not for very long. I can't speak for the whole community, because I'm sure there were women who were more evolved and in many ways healthier than my mother, and could form friendships, and maybe they could give to each other something that I didn't see happen with my mother. So I can really only speak about what I saw in my home. She felt very alone, even though she was very social, very social. She couldn't tolerate the thought of being alone. I mean, every Friday night, we had 20 people minimum for Friday night dinner, every Friday night. And she would pull people in and do this banquet, Persian dishes. You would think it was a wedding, and it was just coming out. The pots were coming out, the platters were coming out, and it was because she needed people around her all the time. There was such a feeling of loneliness inside. And you wouldn't know that if you didn't know her well. You would see a gregarious woman, extroverted, dressed to the hilt, looking beautiful, a witty sense of humor, and you wouldn't say lonely, but she was devastatingly lonely. And so I don't think she had a support system. I don't think she knew how to use a support system because she really didn't know how to connect with people in a way in which it could be lasting. She ran hot and cold. And so as much as people enjoyed her, she would then burn bridges and say things that were hurtful and not think about consequences. So how do you develop a support system that way? And yet she couldn't really look at herself either. She always thought others were at fault and others were not trustworthy. Yeah.
We have another question from Carolyn Oppenheim. Were there Tehrani Jews in Queens when you were growing up? Were the Mashhadi Jews there socialized with them? And then she says, I lived in Tehran in the late 60s as a journalist and got to know people in the Jewish community. And I'm curious if the differences when everyone was in New York were still significant.
Well, again, we lived in this tight-knit Mashhadi community. First it was in Kew Gardens and then it was in Forest Hills, Queens. And I didn't meet Tehranis. This doesn't mean that they didn't live there. If they lived there, we weren't socializing with them.
Wow.
My father had business acquaintances from Tehran. And when they would come to New York, my mother would invite them. And so I met Tehranis that my father knew from Iran, but not those that were living in New York.
When I read this book, I said, I've read a lot about Jews all over the Middle East. And of course, I spent some time there. How come I never heard of this Mashhad thing, that there were people living like conversos in the 20th century? I've never heard about it. Did you run across this? I mean, there's been growing awareness of a whole Mizrahi world that Ashkenazis were blind to for a long, long time. And there's a growing awareness now. But this thing about people in the 20th century living like that in Mashhad, I never heard a thing. And I have an all but dissertation in Middle Eastern studies. So I don't get it. How is this covered up?
It's a very good question. I think the answer is that A, women were illiterate, so they certainly weren't writing. Men were paranoid, and so they weren't keeping memoirs and diaries. Here they are pretending they're Muslim, and they don't want any sign or proof of being anything other than that.
And the Tehranis didn't know about this?
The ones in Tehran, I think they did know what was going on in Mashhad. Of course they did.
Never said a word.
About the Ashkenazi world. And so because we didn't write our story and we have kept rather quiet about it. I mean, that's another reason why I decided to write, because I felt no one has. And it's not the fault of the Ashkenazis. It's that we haven't brought ourselves out from under and we haven't made ourselves known. And hopefully there'll be more writers coming out of the community. But I wanted to break the silence and unveil us. So you're right. That has been a problem. I mean, people are astounded when I've been speaking at different synagogues and Jewish centers and JCCs across the country, and everyone's asking the same question: how come we never knew about the Mashadis? Well, we haven't written ourselves into the story.
Shala, did you want to ask any questions? I know you asked if her parents are, I know you haven't read the book yet, but her parents, Esther's parents passed away a long time ago now, relatively speaking, and very close together, which I thought was so like ironic and a bit of a sad twist for your mom, Esther, that after all those years of kind of in this constant battle with your dad, when she was finally, when your dad had passed away, how many years were there in between their deaths?
My mother died 20 years ago, and my father 24 years ago. So she was alone for only 4 years. But I think that they were so enmeshed with one another that even after he passed away, she used to say, I can't wait for him to die because I need to be freed of this marriage. I need to be freed of him. She would loudly advertise this feeling, and then he died, and she became even more difficult. She became an angrier person. She became a sadder person. She felt emptier. She never said because he died. She would blame it on other things, but I think that there was a symbiotic relationship unbeknownst to them, where he was a foil. He became the reason why she could be angry. I mean, he served a purpose, and he wasn't there, and she was purposeless.
It's really, such a incredible twist of fate, as it were, and twist in the story. Brenda, you said you had one more thing to say, and then we're going to bring things to a close.
Okay. I've run into many people who have read this book. And another thing that I get out of it is, many have said, it is almost like Fiddler on the Roof, that it is translatable in any language, in every culture. This, coming to America, certainly, or any immigrant that comes to another country. But Esther has really made this a book that is not just the Jewish community, not just about Mashad, not just about the Jewish people, but people all the world over. So I applaud her efforts. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you, Brenda.
So Esther, I just want to thank you so much on behalf of all of us who are here, all of us who were really looking forward to this. You did not disappoint, and I think I know I speak on behalf of everyone when I say thank you for writing this powerful memoir with a perfect name, and I think it will continue to give us so much to think about in terms of, what is concealed and what needs to be revealed. And I think you spoke about that so powerfully when you talked about what you hope for your own children, that they will know that they don't have to conceal, who they are, how they think, what's important to them, that they should feel like they can reveal reveal those things and talk about those things openly. And by you sharing your story and revealing all of that which was concealed until now, you've given us a really powerful look into a community I don't think any of us knew anything about, and also into and really invited us into this mysterious, I don't want to say, I don't know if the word is magical, but just unbelievable world. So thank you so much. Friends, I want to just remind you that if you haven't read Esther's book, hopefully by now you are convinced that you should. And you can pick up her book on Amazon, or you can pick it up at your local bookstore. Thank you everyone for coming, and please stay safe, and know that if you need anything, we're always here for you. Just reach out to us, and we want to support you however we can. So thank you, and thank you again, Esther. We really appreciate it. Another round of applause for our wonderful.
Thank all of you for inviting me and asking such interesting questions and wanting to know the story. And I hope you share the book with others and encourage others to pick it up and read it and spread the word. But thanks very much.
Thank you. We surely will.